The original Guild Wars is a highly underappreciated gem of an MMO, and I've watched tons of people review this game, and they seem to miss some of the most important highlights that make it so special. I mean, it was even reviewed by the president of MMOs himself, and I highly recommend his videos. They're great, but he definitely missed some valid points as to what makes Guild Wars amazing. And I played this when it originally came out. I was in love with this game, and I'm not just trying to totally mask this with nostalgia glasses. It's a really solid game, and for three main reasons. Its story, its game mechanics, and its technical limitations actually made it more special. And I really want to dive into this game, so if you like me rambling about any random thing, feel free to subscribe. This is my channel, it's kind of what I do. Now, its story doesn't seem like anything special, but how it was done is what made it so good. The entire story of the original Guild Wars is kind of based around this idea that you're part of the group of humans trying to survive against a very beast-like species called the Charr, and you're just trying to survive and fend off the oncoming horde. But what makes it really cool is that your intro into the game is before this terrible battle actually happens. Basically, you're playing in the past when you're doing your introduction to the game. Your entire tutorial section is this beautiful landscape of Ascalon. And this tutorial section, while it's small, it's just big enough that you really want to explore every possible inch of this place. I mean, it is so well done. It makes you want to get out there and explore, and it's got all these little hidden gems and surprises that make you want to dive deeper into the game. But then once you complete the tutorial, that's when the game really kicks off, because turns out you don't really have the ability to fend off this horde of oncoming enemies, and your kingdom loses, and you basically wind up in the future in this terrible post-apocalyptic wasteland. The rest of the story is pretty straightforward, but it's an MMO. Not many of them have super crazy in-depth stories unless you're going the Final Fantasy route. And it's understandable that this game was kind of lost in the crowd. I mean, it came out in 2005, right at the height of the big MMO boom, when you got World of Warcraft out, you had things like Knights of the Old Republic, City of Heroes, all coming out right around this time, so there was a lot of competition, so it's easy for this game to get lost in the mess of games that were coming out around that time. But where this game really starts to make things a little more interesting is with its game mechanics that weren't really done very often in other games. So just like with most other MMOs, you get to create your character. It's a very simple character creation, but you get to choose your starting class. And the original Guild Wars, before any of its expansions, had the very simple ones. The warrior, the basic, tank type person that you just swing a big weapon or wield a shield. Or you could go with a ranger, somebody that wields a bow and arrow, likes nature, possibly has some sort of pet helping them out, like a bear or a panther or leopard or spider or whatever you want. You had the monk, which in most other fantasy games is usually more of like a martial artist, but in Guild Wars, they were much more of like a holy healer type of thing. They could also smite creatures or buff their allies or heal, which they're the best healers in the game, despite the fact that most other classes or professions had some sort of minor healing added to their abilities, just so everybody had some level of survivability. Then you have the classic necromancer to raise the dead, summon crazy creatures, or siphon life or cause curses or whatever. The slightly more unique Mesmer, which was much more about like mental magic, so you can inflict fear and make your enemies run away or things like that. And then you had the Elementalist, which was pretty much just a mage that could do more elemental magic, which was just the basic like air, earth, fire, and water type spells. Now that seems like very simple professions to have in a game. But what made it really interesting, which is something that I noticed that most other people just kind of forget about or don't notice when they're playing this game for a review, because it's not spelled out until you get into the game and start playing through some random quests, is that you actually get a second profession. So while all of these professions were very basic, you could add in an additional profession of this list as your secondary profession. So if you wanted to be something more like a paladin, go ahead and take your warrior as your main class and then monk as your secondary one. You have plenty of healing and smiting from your secondary class, but you're still very tanky and able to swing that massive weapon. You want to be more of a death knight type creature? Mix your warrior with a necromancer. You want to be the master of nature and elements? Mix a ranger and an elementalist. You want to be the ultimate buffer, debuffer, and healer? Mix monk with mesmer. But my personal favorite was playing as a warrior that also had a pet bear to help him tank, because I mixed my warrior as a main class with a ranger as my secondary class because I really wanted a pet bear and I named him Smokey. But then you got to specialize and make these classes a bit more your own. Now in other MMOs and most other games, you have something like a talent tree. It's obviously what popped up in WoW or even Diablo, or you had the absolutely insane talent tree from something like Path of Exile, but it's a little more simplified in Guild Wars, and for good reason, because in Guild Wars, you only have 8 ability slots. So that means you don't have some massive action bar of choices like you did in World of Warcraft, where it's just an absolute insane amount of choices for an insane amount of different situations. No, you had 8 abilities that you could use, and you had to make sure you allotted those abilities before you left a safe zone or a town. Because once you wound up in the world of adventure, you were on your own and you couldn't switch up anything. But your talent trees were much more simplified to allow you to kind of experiment a bit, because every time you leveled up, you got a handful of attribute points, which you could spend on increasingly expensive attributes. As you put more points into them, they required more points to get the next level. If you were an elementalist, you could focus on certain types of magic. If you were a ranger, you could focus just on your bow skills or maybe your beast that you had as your ally. But if you were something like a warrior, you actually got to specialize what kind of weapon you were using, getting axe mastery, hammer mastery, or sword mastery. So it made it very important that you can swap out these points at any given point, especially because if you were something like a warrior, you might wind up picking up a really good hammer and you're like, oh, I've been putting all my points into swordsmanship. And these points felt very limited because the max level in the original Guild Wars was only 20. If you went into basically any other MMO, you had way more levels to play around with, but only having a max level of 20 made it so you had to be very selective. So being able to experiment was very important. But despite the fact that you had a max level of 20, meaning you had a very limited pool of attribute points, there was something that made it even more special. And that's because if you got to level 20, there was very special quest lines that you could find, and those quest lines would give you some additional attribute points. And if you're maxing out at level 20, attribute points are going to be insanely crucial. There was only 2 of these quest lines in the original Guild Wars. Every expansion only came out with 2 more quest lines on top of that, and they were not easy. They were pretty difficult quests that you had to find groups to be able to complete. And Guild Wars made it really easy to be able to play the entire game on your own, especially because in the game, at every major town, you could grab some mercenaries to help you out and have a full party of a tank, healer, and damage dealer backing you up in every scenario, and they would just be NPCs. But you really wanted some actual players to help you out with these quests, because everybody was starved for the extra attribute points here. But I remember when I went in with my warrior and my pet bear and all of these people that I had found in the game, and we took the time to complete this entire quest line, and it took a while and it was difficult. And when we got to the end, it was one of the moments that you have in gaming when you feel like you really got somewhere. And I remember we sat at the end of this quest and we were up on this weird cliffside in the game staring at this artificial sunset. And I remember somebody saying, we actually did it. And it was this amazing moment that is going to sit with me for a long time because it just felt so good. And we just sat there enjoying that moment. We knew that it was something we weren't going to be able to do again anytime soon. And this was a group of people I had never met in real life. It was a group that I never partied with again. A group that we feel like we really came together to do this incredibly difficult thing together. And this was especially amazing to me because Guild Wars was one of the few games that I could actually play growing up. You see, there were technical limitations that Guild Wars imposed on itself, or maybe because it was just cheaper for them to do so on the development front. But there were two big reasons that Guild Wars was one of the few games that I could play. One, my internet sounded like this. Yeah, and for those that don't know the ancient song of my people, that's what the internet used to sound like if you didn't have high-speed internet. You see, today, you can pretty easily find gigabit level internet. And even more commonly, you'll wind up with 500 megabytes per second or something on the lower end, 150 megabytes per second. And they even had this thing called DSL, which ranged from 1 to 100 megabytes per second, depending on how many people had it around you. But my house didn't have that. You see, I had dial-up, which was only 56 kilobytes per second. And for those that don't know, a megabyte is 1,000 kilobytes. And having something like gigabyte speeds today is 1,000 megabytes. So that was a pretty drastic difference that, frankly, my dial-up speeds couldn't handle most other games. Not to mention, Guild Wars didn't have a subscription fee. And if I wanted to play something like WoW, which required a subscription, there was no way that I was going to convince my parents to pay extra money every single month just for me to play one game. So I got to buy the game once, and then I got to play it on my dial-up internet because of how the game was developed. You see, you only had to download each map once. You would get a loading screen, which on dial-up would take forever, but I would sit there and let it download and finally get that map for the area that I wanted to explore. You would only run into other players in these safe zones or cities. And then once you wanted to explore an adventure, you would have to leave the city, go through another loading zone, which took forever, and then you were out in the world of adventure that was just for you. Because once that area loaded, only you and anybody that was originally in your party when you left the town would be there. Everything else was an NPC or an enemy. And this created some really interesting dynamics because there actually wound up being a job in the game referred to as a runner. These were usually warriors or rangers that could run pretty quickly and get you to the next town. Because in order to further the story, you had to get to the next town, get to an instance, which require another loading screen, and then you would progress and get to the next one and the next. But if you wound up in a group in a major town, you could leave that city together, and then one of you could run to the next city, and the rest of the party would be teleported there the second that you entered. So people would often hire runners. They would pay a certain amount of in-game gold, and then they would go out into the adventure land, and then that person would get them to the next city safely. It was an interesting dynamic that I didn't expect to find, and when I was playing as a warrior, I often wound up utilizing this to get some extra in-game currency to buy whatever I needed to salvage equipment or get new items. And it actually allowed me as a dial-up player to be able to play with other people, because as long as I did that initial loading screen once, it was already installed on my computer. So I could play it over and over again without waiting an insanely long time to load the next area. So even when I was going into a dungeon or instance, I would make sure to load that up ahead of time, and then later when I wanted to find a group, I didn't have to worry about loading. It only wound up turning into an issue later when there were multi-level dungeons, and then I would actually get stuck at a loading screen for so long on my dial-up internet that the party would just kind of forget about me, go to the next area, and then next thing you know, I'm in that area alone because they had already gotten so far ahead. They're like 1 or 2 loading zones ahead of where I am. So I was kind of stuck, and it took me way longer to finish certain instances because of it. Now, I loved this game growing up. I loved it for its faults. I loved it for its unique ideas, and I absolutely loved the main class, secondary class system, and I wish that was incorporated in way more games because it created so many unique possibilities. I loved my Warrior Ranger, but I've gone back in more recently and found that there's actually a surprisingly large player base for a game that's almost 20 years old at this point, and people are still playing. And a lot of people are actually doing this weird challenge where in the starting area, even though it's just the tutorial area, you're only supposed to get to around level 3 to 5 in order to progress in the story and get to the massive wasteland and keep exploring. There's this challenge that people kind of self-impose in trying to get to the max level just in the starter area, and that area winds up being like this cool little hangout spot for a lot of people. I was so in love with this game that when Guild Wars 2 came out, I was super hyped about it until I got in there and found out they were trying to do a few things that Final Fantasy did with swapping out weapons, changing your abilities, but they completely removed the secondary class system, so I was very disappointed in that. But it still makes me love the original game to an incredible extent. And if you want to check it out, it's still available on Steam, and you wind up having to create an account on ArenaNet, and you're probably going to want to tweak some of the resolution settings, but it still runs amazingly well. But I would recommend that you start in the Prophecy storyline because that really sets the mood of the entire campaign, and it's really pretty solid. I love this game and the fact that it was one of the few that I could play on my dial-up. I'm trying not to view it through nostalgia glasses, but it is a little hard. If there's any other games that you know of that have that secondary class system, let me know, because I love games like that and I want to hunt down as many of them as I can to play them. But if you've tried the original Guild Wars, I'd love to know what you think, because I knew a lot of people that were playing other MMOs and they're like, oh, it's got a max level of 20. Why the hell would I want to play that? Or they didn't think it was developed enough, but its simplicity is what I loved about it. So if you like this game, or if you've never tried it, or if you have any other recommendations, I'd love to hear about it. I'm just that guy, RJ. That's just my opinion, and I got plenty of them. That's why I have this entire channel, so feel free to check out some other stuff.